They came not for Egypt, but for Jerusalem. Yet on the banks of the Nile their destiny was decided, not by sword alone, but by pride, politics, and the rising floodwaters of a mighty river. By the early 13th century, Jerusalem was in Muslim hands, its golden dome of the rock gleaming above streets where Crusader banners no longer flew. Europe had failed to hold the Holy City after the glories of the First Crusade. The Third Crusade, led by Richard the Lionheart, had won great victories, but not Jerusalem itself. The Fourth Crusade had not even reached the Holy Land. Its swords turned instead upon Constantinople. Now the Fifth Crusade would aim not at the city of Christ, but at the fertile plains and ancient waters of Egypt. For the Crusaders believed that here, in the heart of the Ayyubid Sultanate, lay the key to Jerusalem. Part 1, The Call to Egypt. Pope Innocent III, still stung by the disgrace of the Fourth Crusade, issued the papal bull Quia Maior in April 1213. His strategy broke with earlier thinking. Instead of directly attacking Palestine, the Crusaders would strike Egypt, the breadbasket and power center of the Ayyubid Sultanate. By seizing the Nile Delta, they could strangle Muslim trade, threaten Cairo, and force the surrender of Jerusalem through negotiation. Recruitment stretched across Europe. Hungary's King Andrew II, famed for his earlier wars in Eastern Europe, Duke Leopold VI of Austria, a patron of the arts and seasoned commander, and John of Brienne, titular King of Jerusalem by marriage, all took the cross. The Pope promised remission of sins to all who served. The great military orders, the Knights Templar, Knights Hospitaller, and the rising Teutonic Order, pledged their banners. But the Holy Roman Emperor, Frederick II, though he took the cross, stalled for political reasons. His absence would cast a long shadow. Part 2. Early campaign in the Levant, 1217 to 1218. The first major forces gathered at Acre in 1217, under Andrew II and John of Brienne. They attempted raids inland toward Mount Tabor and Basin, hoping to weaken Muslim garrisons. These were little more than skirmishes, costly in lives and supplies, with no permanent gains. Andrew soon returned to Hungary, taking many troops with him. But in 1218, new fleets arrived from the Low Countries, northern Germany and Italy. With these reinforcements came Cardinal Pelagius Galvani, the Pope's legate. Though not a soldier, his authority from Rome allowed him to overrule even the king. In time, Pelagius' uncompromising approach would drive the Crusades' greatest blunders. Part 3. The Siege of Damietta, 1218 to 1219. The decision to strike Damietta was both daring and desperate. It was not merely another coastal city. Damietta was the jewel of the Nile Delta, a gateway into the very heart of Egypt. Whoever held it controlled not just a port, but a lifeline. The arteries of trade, the movement of armies, the key to Cairo itself. But the Crusaders soon discovered the city was shielded by more than stone. Rising from the waters like a sentinel was the Burj al-Silsila, the chain tower. From its massive foundations stretched an iron chain thick as a man's arm, barring all ships from entering the Nile Channel. To the Crusaders it seemed an unbreakable barrier, a symbol of Egypt's defiance. The siege began in June 1218. The Crusaders encamped along the banks, their banners fluttering over a camp that quickly swelled into a sprawling city of tents, forges, chapels, and markets. Across the water, Damietta's towers bristled with archers and engines, hurling stones and fire into the attackers' lines. The Nile itself became a battlefield, its surface churned by skirmishes between Muslim galleys and Crusader vessels. Among the besiegers rose a figure of ingenuity. Oliver of Paderborn, a German priest who turned his mind to the mechanics of war. Under his guidance, carpenters and blacksmiths built great mangonels, hurling stones that shook Damietta's walls. Most ambitious of all was a colossal wooden tower, mounted upon two last ships. Taller than the chain tower itself, it loomed over the river like a floating fortress. In August 1218, under cover of crossbow volleys and flaming pitch, the Crusaders maneuvered this tower alongside the chain tower. Amid smoke, screams, and the crash of stones, knights and sailors scaled its ladders. For hours they fought hand to hand above the waters until at last the cross of Christ flew from the battlements. The chain that had guarded Damietta for generations now lay in Christian hands. Yet victory came at a price. Summer heat in the mists of the Nile brought fever. Malaria, dysentery, and plague spread as swiftly as arrows. The Crusaders buried their dead in long trenches. Damietta's defenders suffered no less. Both sides endured a siege of attrition where hunger and disease claimed more than sword or spear. But still the walls of Damietta stood, grim, unyielding, as months turned into a grinding stalemate. Fifth Crusade Part 4. The Offer of Jerusalem. In December 1218, a sudden shift rippled through the defenders' camp. Sultan al-Adil, father of Egypt's rulers, died. His passing cast the Ayyubid dynasty into turmoil. His son al-Kamil inherited Egypt in its hour of peril, beset by Crusader engines, hemmed in by disease, and facing mutiny among his emirs. Al-Kamil was no mere warrior. He was a shrewd politician, a man who understood that survival sometimes lay not in battle but in bargain. Recognizing the danger, he dispatched envoys with a breathtaking offer. Jerusalem itself, the holy city. Vast territories of the old Crusader kingdom. Even the relic of relics, the true cross, lost since Hattin. To the weary Crusaders, it was the very dream for which they had marched. John of Brienne, the titular king of Jerusalem, urged acceptance. He had seen firsthand the cost of these wars and knew such a prize might never again be offered without blood. But within the Crusader camp, a storm brewed. Cardinal Pelagius, armed with papal authority, would hear no compromise. For him, Jerusalem gained by treaty was a hollow prize. Egypt itself was within reach, he argued. And once conquered, it would yield not only Jerusalem, but secure it forever. To retreat now, even in triumph, was to abandon God's will. The Knights Templar and Hospitallers, hardened by decades of defense in the Levant, backed Pelagius. They feared that without Egypt's fall, Jerusalem regained by treaty could not be held. And so the offer was refused. Historians would later look back on this moment with disbelief. The city lost at Hattin, prayed for in cathedrals across Europe, stood within their grasp, and they turned away. Pride, distrust, and the dream of total victory blinded them to the chance of peace. Part 5. The Fall of Damietta. The siege dragged into a second year. Inside Damietta, hunger gnawed. Grain stores were nearly empty. Disease carried off thousands. Desertion spread even among the defenders. When al-Kamil's relief attempts failed, despair gripped the garrison. In the Crusader camp, months of suffering bred impatience. Mangonels thundered without pause, and in October 1219, a section of the walls crumbled under relentless assault. On November 5th, after 17 months of defiance, the gates were forced. Crusaders surged into the city in a frenzy of looting and bloodshed. The fall of Damietta was both triumph and tragedy. For the first time since the First Crusade, the Latins had seized a great Muslim city in the east. Churches rang with victory hymns. Banners of the cross flew over the ramparts. But beneath the rejoicing lurked bitter divisions. Who would govern Damietta? The Pope's legate, or John of Brienne, the king in name of Jerusalem? Supplies piled in warehouses but rotted without distribution. The army, swollen with mercenaries, drifted into indiscipline. Worse still, the Crusaders had no plan beyond the capture. What next? Cairo? A truce? Or fortify their prize and wait? Rivalries paralyzed them, and months passed with no decision. For the Egyptians, Damietta's loss was grievous but not fatal. Al-Kamil withdrew, regrouped, and waited. He knew the Nile was patient, and the Crusaders, for all their zeal, were not. The victory that should have opened the road to Jerusalem had instead set the stage for ruin. Part 6. The March to Cairo, 1221. By the summer of 1221, the Crusaders had held Damietta for nearly 2 years. Supplies from Europe continued to arrive, yet within the camp there was no unity, no vision for what to do next. John of Brienne counseled patience, to fortify their gains, open negotiations, or wait for reinforcements. But Cardinal Pelagius, the Pope's iron-willed legate, grew restless. To him, the conquest of Damietta meant nothing if Cairo itself, the beating heart of Egypt, was not seized. Against the advice of John and many seasoned commanders, Pelagius gave the order, advance upon Cairo. The Crusader host that assembled was immense. Some chroniclers claim nearly 40,000, though perhaps fewer. Knights of the temple and hospital rode in gleaming mail. Mercenary infantry carried pikes, crossbows, and shields. Priests marched with relics, chanting litanies. Behind them trailed a train of wagons, siege machines, and supply ships sailing up the Nile to shadow the army's advance. The march began in July, under a punishing Egyptian sun. The air shimmered with heat, armor seared to the touch. Every mile southward meant deeper peril, for the Crusaders were now far from their base at Damietta, dependent upon the river for supplies. Egyptian cavalry, swift and elusive, shadowed their movements, harrying stragglers and striking suddenly before vanishing into the fields. The march led them toward Mansoura, a town whose name meant the victorious. Beyond it, the road to Cairo stretched wide, at least in the Crusaders' dreams. But they had forgotten the ancient ally of Egypt, the Nile itself. As August approached, the flood season began. The river swelled, and al-Kamil's engineers, masters of the waterways, opened sluice gates and cut canals. Within days, the fields that had seemed dry beneath the Crusaders' feet turned into a swampy trap. What had been a road became a quagmire. Horses sank to their bellies. Wagons stuck fast. Supplies could no longer move forward, and still Pelagius pressed on, convinced God's will would prevail. Part 7. Encirclement at Mansoura. The Crusaders soon found themselves trapped between water and enemy. The Nile, now swollen with floodwaters, spread across the plain, cutting off escape routes. Their fleet, which had once supplied them, was blocked by Egyptian ships armed with fire, rams, and showers of arrows. Al-Kamil's cavalry circled constantly, striking at the edges, vanishing before counterattack. Disease followed swiftly. Men waded through stagnant waters teeming with insects. Fever swept through the camp. Bread grew moldy, grain spoiled, and wine turned sour in the heat. Horses died in droves, their carcasses rotting where they fell. The army that had once marched with hymns now staggered in silence. Morale collapsed. Mercenaries demanded payment. Knights quarreled with priests, and desertion spread. John of Brienne pleaded for retreat before disaster struck. But Pelagius, unwilling to admit error, delayed until retreat was no longer possible. By late August, the Crusaders were hemmed in completely. To fight was hopeless. To stand meant starvation. Only surrender remained. On August 28, 1221, the papal legate swallowed his pride and sued for peace. The terms were humiliating. Damietta, won at such cost, held for 2 years, was to be returned to al-Kamil. In return, the Crusaders would be allowed to withdraw under truce. The Nile that had seemed the road to Cairo had become the grave of their hopes. As the survivors trudged back toward Acre, they left behind the wreckage of their ambitions. Chroniclers recorded the bitterness of knights and common soldiers alike. They had set out believing they might secure Jerusalem for Christendom. Instead, they returned in defeat, their banners tattered, their cause stained with pride and division. Part 8. Aftermath and Legacy. The Fifth Crusade ended in failure, and worse, squandered opportunity. Jerusalem had been offered without a fight and refused. Pelagius returned to Rome in disgrace. John of Brienne's reputation survived, but his influence waned. Al-Kamil, now secure in Egypt, would later negotiate with Frederick II during the Sixth Crusade, handing over Jerusalem peacefully, something the Fifth Crusade might have achieved years earlier. The defeat deepened tensions between the papacy and secular rulers, sowed mistrust between Crusader factions, and reinforced the lesson that unity was as vital as faith on campaign. The Nile at dusk. They had marched to the Nile believing it would lead them to Jerusalem. But their path was flooded, not just by the waters of Egypt, but by pride, politics, and missed chances. The Fifth Crusade stands as both a warning and a question. How close did they come to changing history forever?
Please subscribe and look for more documentaries at Swords and Shadows.